Dollar. Dirt and money, no soul. Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack and flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.
Yup, what's good, original crew, man? We're back. Hey, we're back on the channel, man. Hey, we got a new Mr. Ballin' for us today. His confidence became the death of him. That's a title. What you think?
Deep. I agree. It is a title. Why are you looking like that? Okay, that is.
I ain't saying a word.
Yeah, you're saying it all with your eyes, with your face.
No, I haven't said a word.
Yeah.
See, I haven't said a word,
And
big
don't.
girl. Hey, make sure y'all check out the links in the description
Down
box.
below.
Hold on, slow down. You already know where to go if you want to first support. All you gotta do is check out down below. Also, if
Babe, come on.
you enjoy today's video,
Look at it with a thumbs up.
let me get the video out. Also, shout out to the comment of the day.
Shout out to you.
We highly appreciate it.
You play too much.
You play too much, man. Let's get it. You ready?
I'm ready.
Today, we have two stories about people who finally got to attend an event that they'd been working toward for years, but in both cases, actually going to these events would turn out to be the biggest mistakes of their lives. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to shovel the snow off the like button's driveway. But be sure to shovel the snow directly into their car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Evidence. On the morning of November 18th, 2019, 54-year-old detective Muzi Mkhize stood in a long line waiting to get into a courthouse in Ikapa, South Africa. So Muzi was an investigator on a very violent robbery case that was finally being tried today, even though the robbery itself had happened almost 6 years earlier. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse in Ikapa and brutally beat the couple before making off with a bunch of electronics and jewelry and weapons and other valuables. And so Muzi and his team had eventually caught and arrested these criminals, and in fact, they were even able to recover some of the items that had been stolen. In fact, now, Muzi had one of those stolen items with him to present as evidence at today's trial. Muzi had done this kind of court duty plenty of times in his career, but today, he felt really drained. On top of his trial prep for, this case, he'd also been working other active cases and also mentoring junior detectives. And Muzi was not young and energetic anymore. He was nearing retirement age, and all these obligations were really starting to take a toll on him. But the biggest thing that was really exhausting Muzi was this robbery case itself. It had been an extremely long process, full of an unusual number of delays and complications. It had actually taken so long to bring this to trial that the evidence Muzi was holding, like literally right now, had actually been returned to the victim couple so they could use it until the trial finally happened. So getting this case to this point had been extremely tiring, but Muzi and his team were determined to see it through no matter what, because the criminals that did this, they were incredibly violent and genuinely needed to be behind bars to protect the public. They'd severely beaten this couple to the point where they were hospitalized, and it was lucky they hadn't been killed. As Muzi entered the courthouse and passed through the court security checkpoint, he hoped the security guards were appropriately on alert. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones who were on trial today, often had violent friends, especially in Ikapa, where this kind of crime was unfortunately rampant. It wasn't unheard of for criminals or gang members to barge into court proceedings and retaliate against cops or prosecution. But Muzi was able to get through security. There was no suspicious people or any sort of disruptions of any kind. And so Muzi, once through, made his way into the courtroom. And he saw the space was already full. The defense and the jury and prosecutors and judge were all there, and there were members of the public in the gallery. Muzi went over and sat down at the prosecution table, and he would remain there until it was his turn to go up to the judge and present, which would include, showing this evidence. As Muzi got settled into his seat and, put the evidence down in his lap, he turned and sort of gave a quick wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting at the table as well. She was going over her trial notes. Muzi had worked with Adelaide before, and they got along really well together. And she was a total pro, at least in Muzi's mind. So he knew that, her being on board meant this case had a really good chance of getting a conviction. Adelaide waved back at Muzi and then quickly got back to her notes. And Muzi took a look around the courtroom and everything seemed quiet and, again, there was no sign of any gang members or criminal friends charging in to cause problems. And, Muzi just hoped it would stay this way and that the trial would go smoothly and end the way he hoped it would. A few minutes later, and the judge sort of called the court to order and got the trial started, at which point Adelaide got up and began to present the case. And at this moment, despite the fact that Muzi had waited almost 6 years to get to this point, at this moment, when it finally was happening, he just felt this enormous wave of exhaustion sweep over him. He wasn't energized, it was sort of the opposite. It was like relief. And also, the room they were in was pretty hot, and, he was pretty tired, and before long, his eyelids got heavier, and eventually his head kind of slumped over to the side, and he dozed off. And at first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, Muzi just slept in the courtroom, and nobody even noticed or cared. Everything was okay. But then at some point, there was this sudden, very loud scraping sound. It was the sound of a bunch of chairs in the courtroom moving across the ground, and it was just very loud, and it woke Muzi up, but like really abruptly. He was startled by the sound, and when he woke up, like in his, sudden jolting awake, he dropped the evidence that he was supposed to be in charge of onto the ground. And so he's getting up, he's getting his bearings, realizing that it's kind of embarrassing. He was asleep. Did anybody see him? Like, what's going on? Everyone's moving around. He sees the evidence on the ground. So he goes under the table, he scoops the evidence back up. And as he's sitting back up, he hears this loud, like deafening bang echo through the courtroom. And he still really doesn't know what's going on. I mean, he just woke up. It's sort of chaotic in the room. And then he hears this scream coming from the side, sort of over to his right. And he turns and he realizes the scream came from the prosecutor, Adelaide. And so Muzi looks over the table and he sees Adelaide laying on the ground and she's clutching her hip. And her hip is now gushing blood. And so obviously she's been attacked. That loud banging sound he heard was almost certainly a gunshot or an explosion of some kind. And so Muzi immediately is thinking, clearly the friends or affiliates of these criminals on trial have stormed the courthouse and they've attacked us. They've attacked Adelaide. Are there more shooters here? Are there more attackers in the building? And so Muzi, who again, he's only woken up like 30 seconds ago, he's still sort of confused. He begins looking around the courthouse for, perpetrators, someone who's attacking, a gunman or something. But all he sees is just the chaos of people trying to flee the courthouse and others rushing up to Adelaide to try to render care. Like there were no perpetrators, there were no gunmen, there was nothing. It was just chaos. And so for a second, Muzi is just sitting there, not really even sure what to do, almost like paralyzed by shock. And also, again, he's just woken up. He's sort of getting his bearings. And then he thinks of something. He's looking around the courthouse, this crazy scene. And he realizes that there is no gunman. There's no perpetrator. There's nobody. There's nothing. Which can only mean one thing. So to understand what happened inside of that courtroom, you first have to understand something about South African police procedure. And that is that in South Africa, as in most countries, after evidence is taken from the scene of a crime, it's examined and determined to be safe and then transferred to an exhibit room until it's time for trial. However, unlike in other parts of the world, in South Africa, there are exceptions to this procedure. And this trial had taken almost 6 years to start. And because of that huge time lag, some of the evidence that was recovered from the robbers' homes had actually been returned to the victim couple it was taken from, so they could just use it until the trial finally happened. The couple had returned that particular evidence to the police that morning, and Muzi had been charged with bringing that evidence to court and literally holding that evidence. But Muzi, when he did this, didn't double check to make sure this evidence was safe to be in a courtroom. And sometime after Muzi fell asleep in the courtroom, the judge had announced that it was time to take a break. And so the scraping of chairs that woke him up was the sound of people getting up to leave.
Right.
But for Muzi, it startled him and he sat up really suddenly, what's going on? And he dropped this evidence onto the ground. And it would turn out this was like the worst thing that could have possibly happened. Because this particular evidence was a shotgun. And when Muzi, sort of in his panicked, instinctive state, when he first woke up and he saw the evidence on the ground, he reached down to grab it, to pick it back up, because he was supposed to hold this thing for the whole trial and present it. The last thing he needed is people to see that he had fallen asleep and dropped it on the ground. But when he scooped it up, the gun, again, because it had not been re-examined, it would turn out it was still loaded. And so as he scooped it up, he accidentally hit the trigger and fired it, and it hit Adelaide, severed an artery, and killed her. But Muzi, was so confused by the chaos of the scene that at first, he didn't even realize he had fired the gun. He just scooped up the gun, heard the bang, and he's like, what's going on here? And it was when he realized there was no gunman that he looked down, and he realized the shotgun was aimed right at Adelaide. He must have shot her. Muzi ultimately pled guilty to culpable homicide and negligence, and he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, it was suspended.
Negligence, bro. Pure negligence. Honestly, y'all gotta get a better system too.
I'm about to say it's
That's
everyone.
a faulty system.
But there should be no reason why.
For one, the trial take 6 years.
Yeah, I was about to say that was a long time.
And for the evidence to be returned back to the couple, they could ain't no telling what people can do.
Return back to you. No one is checking in, making sure that it's even safe to be in court around people, and then you just handling it all willy nilly. Then you falling asleep with the evidence in your lap. It's just a lot happening.
Too much happening. Too much negligence.
Yeah, and rest in peace to Adelaide.
Yeah, Adelaide.
Adelaide. But what?
That's a crazy scenario, bro.
It really is.
You can pay me to think that would have happened.
So what happened with the case overall? Because
here you go. Now you want to know about this?
Yeah, because she was the prosecutor on it, and then now since was it delayed even longer?
Or did they have a backup prosecutor?
Or did they have
assistant prosecutor?
But yeah, that's sad though. I hate that.
On the morning of July 14th, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden, getting dressed and ready for the day. And he was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympics. So a marathon is a race that covers exactly 26.2 miles. And for elite runners, it usually takes them between 2 and 3 hours to finish. Lazaro was representing Portugal, and this was actually a really big deal. This was his home country's very first Olympics, which meant Lazaro was one of only a few Portuguese athletes at the Games. And Lazaro believed that out of all of those people, all those other Portuguese athletes, he actually stood the best chance at bringing home an actual medal. So Lazaro had a chance to do something really historic for his country. And realistically, he wasn't even that nervous, because he knew he was a truly elite, incredible runner. Even though he was just 21 years old, Lazaro had already won 3 huge marathons in Portugal. So he was already a star back home. But he knew that if he wanted to win on the world stage, he would need to come extremely prepared. So that's exactly what he'd done. He'd trained for months, obviously. He'd also recently gotten a medical exam to confirm that he was very healthy. And he'd even begun thinking about, little ways that he could potentially give himself a boost, like how to fuel, what to put in his body and even what to put on his body. I mean, even the smallest detail, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that kind of sat heavily in his stomach, could make the difference between winning or losing. Because again, this is like the world's best runners. Any little edge he was going to take it. So now, Lazaro spent the next hour putting on the very specific clothes that he had selected for this race, and also eating a perfectly balanced light meal containing carbohydrates and protein, basically exactly what he had mapped out to help him in this race. He'd been warned that it was supposed to be very, very hot today on race day. But Lazaro actually saw this as an advantage, because being from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than places like Sweden, Lazaro already knew how to protect himself from the sun and the heat, and how to give himself an edge in this weather. And then before he knew it, Lazaro was ready to go, and he had left his hotel room, and he was on his way to the stadium to actually compete in the Olympics. A few hours later, around 1:45 p.m., Lazaro walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive stadium where the race was going to start. And as race officials directed him and his 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Lazaro was feeling really confident. In fact, so confident that he called out to a nearby reporter that he was going to be the winner, saying, quote, "I win or I die." Now, as Lazaro and the others actually took their spots on the starting line, they were in the direct sunlight, and it was just unbelievably hot. I mean, in the shade, it was already 90 degrees, so it was like a sweltering day. But as Lazaro looked up and down the line of the other competitors, he saw everybody else look flushed and they were sweating profusely. They looked not ready to go run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed. But Lazaro, he was not overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, Lazaro wasn't even sweating. As Lazaro stood there waiting for this race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people in the stands. And for a moment, he just stood there taking it all in and just, appreciating how special this moment really was. The marathon was a major event in these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out, and even the king and queen of Stockholm were supposed to be somewhere in the crowd watching this. And as Lazaro stood there having this moment, sort of taking it all in, he also had this certainty that when this race was finished, all those people in the stadium and around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer tell the runners to take their marks. And Lazaro felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. A big hush fell over the crowd, and Lazaro and the rest of the racers stopped moving and just tensed, waiting for the signal. A couple of seconds went by, and then, bang, the starting gun went off. And Lazaro and everybody else lunged forward. And there was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line, and Lazaro was pushed back towards the middle of the pack. And right off the bat, Lazaro was a little surprised by how quick the overall pace was. But Lazaro still wasn't worried. He'd studied this course extensively, and he knew that he'd have a chance to get out in front of his competitors pretty soon. This marathon route was very flat. But Lazaro was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous terrain. So he was sure that once the other runners invariably started to get tired, especially from this hot weather, he'd still be feeling fine and he could move out in front. So Lazaro just decided to hang back and wait to make his move as they moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt road beyond. And for the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan and just kept his pace steady in the back. He knew, at some point, people would begin falling off as the heat wore down on them and they got tired, and he'd be able to make his way up, so he wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was sort of keeping his pace in the back, he even was able to give another soundbite to one of the reporters that was on the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Lazaro really felt like he was running the race of his life. It was like everything in his training and in his background had prepared him to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently moving past runners, some of whom were really struggling in the heat because they clearly weren't used to it. Some had actually stopped running altogether and just put their hands on their knees, while others just sat on the ground, unable to get up. So basically everything was playing out exactly the way Lazaro expected it to. He was, making his move slowly but surely towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for Lazaro, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. He just felt really off. His legs got a really heavy, just like lead feeling, and a few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry. Lazaro kept on running and, told himself he was fine, and that this was just, late race fatigue kicking in. And for what it's worth, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that at about the 19 to 20 mile mark, that's sort of the real halfway of the race, not the 13-mile mark. The 20-mile mark is where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. And so he's basically saying that, oh, that's normal. This happens when you hit about 20 miles. And so as Lazaro worked as hard as he could to put one foot in front of the other and just to keep on going, he began telling himself that, this was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name, and he was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to just completely giving out. And he slammed to the ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour, at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled in a man on a stretcher. They explained that this man was named Francisco Lazaro, and he'd collapsed in the middle of the marathon. And the doctor was really not surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who'd gotten sick from this really oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began specifically examining Lazaro, he knew that this case was different and was much, much more serious. His other patients that day had all relatively mild symptoms like sweating and general fatigue and dizziness, which had easily been cured by providing water and cooling them off. But Lazaro, he was twitching and convulsing, and he was shouting deliriously that he'd won the race. So the doctor rushed him into an exam room and took his temperature. And when he saw it was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit, he knew this situation was critical. A temperature that high was often fatal, and Lazaro's organs were likely already shutting down. And so the doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in some water and some ice, but Lazaro, he did not respond to the hospital's treatments. And as the hours passed by, Lazaro actually got worse. The doctor and his team, they worked through the night treating Lazaro and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Lazaro died. After Lazaro's death, that doctor just could not shake the idea that something just felt off about Lazaro's death. Heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Lazaro had seemed to have a very bad case of heat stroke, but lots of runners had gotten heat stroke during this marathon, and all of them had wound up being fine. So the doctor ultimately decided to run some tests on Lazaro to see if maybe there was something else that had been going on, like maybe there was some underlying illness or other factor that was to blame for his death. And when the doctor finally did get those tests back, the results made Lazaro famous. So remember, Lazaro had put a lot of thought into how to prepare for this big race. He trained extremely hard, he ate right, he chose the right clothes, the right shoes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken in advance of this race had paid off. Especially when Lazaro looked down the line at the start and he saw all the other runners were pouring sweat and flush and just looking horrible. It just seemed like everybody was already exhausted before they had even started. But not Lazaro. He wasn't even sweating because of one of the precautions he had taken. But not sweating in this type of heat was actually a very bad thing. Sweat is the body's way of cooling itself down. So Lazaro's lack of sweat was actually a sign that he was in danger. And it was all thanks to Lazaro's extra strong sunscreen. Because it would turn out Lazaro was so prepared that he went out and found what he thought would be the best and most powerful sunscreen option ever. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of animal fat that's typically used in cooking or making candles and soap. It's also sometimes used for skincare, since it has a lot of nutrients and is generally good for the skin. And Lazaro believed that because suet is very thick, it would act as a barrier against the intensity of the sun. So he slathered a bunch of suet all over his body just before the big race. What he didn't anticipate was that this suet that was now all over him would work too well. It was so thick that it clogged the pores in his skin and prevented anything from passing through, even sweat.
Yeah.
And without a way to cool itself down, Lazaro's body essentially turned into a furnace, which cooked him from the inside out. The weekend after Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him, and over 20,000 people attended to pay tribute to him. And it's probably not quite the type of fame he had hoped for.
Yeah.
But Lazaro's name is still frequently referenced today in Portugal. The Portuguese refer to someone who looks sick and bedraggled as looking like Lazaro.
That's a horrible way to be remembered, dog.
Wow.
I knew it. I was like, it's something like. I'm like, he wasn't sweating. He literally cooked himself. Man, that's sad, bro. Just sad to think about, for real.
It really is. Just, because you just wanting to win, wanting to go out there, do what you love, have a good race, taking all the, measures, not thinking anything of it.
Also, we got to think about the time period, too. You know what I'm saying? Then it's a lot of lack of knowledge. You know what I'm saying? Lack of information, lack of...
like we always say, some things, happen, and
we have
the different times for you to learn from it.
Yeah. Reason why we got precautions now is unfortunate for people dying and going through things in the past. Still sad,
Sucks,
man.
Yeah.
Y'all spam us up, man. Y'all let us know y'all thoughts about it for us in the comments down below, man. But until next time, y'all know how it go, man. I do go by the name DJ New Kid. This is
Cee Nicole.
We are.
Kid and C.
We are.
Ain't no time to kick it, got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar, 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 dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar, 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 dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money low, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.